Hi, this is Bill Gueswich, and welcome to part 2 of dependency injection. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about service lifetimes, and specifically going to take you through an example that shows you the differences between the singleton, scoped, and transient service lifetimes. So there are 3 types of service lifetimes. The first is the singleton, which, when it gets defined, it actually lives through the entire life of the service container, and in many cases in a .NET Core application, that's the life of the application when it starts up. As we've shown in some of our other videos, we start up a host builder, and that host builder stays around to respond to requests, and when that host goes away, then the object goes away, but the application essentially ends. So singleton is the first one. Scoped is the second, which says it's part of, it lives through the duration of the request. A scoped service would exist from the beginning of the request through to the end of the request. The last lifetime is transient. That says that every time you create or you request the object, you're getting a new instance of that object. For the lifetime example, what I'd like to show you is a few things. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to have a person object that I will define 3 different ways using dependency injection. I'll define it as a singleton, I'll define it as scoped, and I'll define it as transient. And then I'm going to include, I'm just going to print off the first name field, not print off, I'll just write it to the debug console, the first name in each one of those. First I'll set it, and then I will show it in the debug console. And first we'll do that in main. And then I'll have a Blazor form that will have a check names button. And when you click on that, it will call a service called service 1. And service 1 will use the transient service, person service, the scoped person service, and the singleton person service. And we'll once again print the first name to the console, the debug console, so you see how it reacts there. And then service 1 will call service 2, which will also define the person transient, the person scoped, and the person singleton service. And we'll once again print off the first name field so that you can see the different values. And the way I've depicted it here is, as you can see, what we will show is that the person singleton lives throughout all of this. So we can set a value for first name in main, and you're going to see it when we go into service 1 that it's still set. And then we'll change it in here, but you'll also see it in service 2. For person scoped, we'll set a value here, and you'll see it printed when we print it out in the main method. But because service 1 now requests it and it's scoped, you won't see it when we print it out initially here in service 1, because the lifetime for this is per request, and it's once we click the check name, this is the request, and that's why I've drawn it this way. Now you will see it in service 2 because service 2 is part of this, and so you will see whatever value we set in service 1, you're going to see it in service 2. And then finally, in person transient, you will not see it when we first call in person transient in service 1, and then because it's a transient service, even though service 2 is called by service 1, you'll see that the first name value does not live between these, it gets a separate instance here. So I thought that showing a first name field in the different states along the way would be a good way to do that. So let's go back to Visual Studio and take a look at that. So here we are back in Visual Studio, and as I mentioned, I've got a couple of services set up to show the different types of lifetimes. So in this one, let's take a look. First we have person service, iPerson service. Let me just get rid of that. iPerson service just has the first name. I'm not even going to worry about the walk method. Okay? And then I have three other interfaces. One that's singleton, and that implements iPerson service. One that's scoped, iPerson scoped, and again, I'm just using these names. You'll see when I get to the dependency to the startup class, you'll see how I use them. And then we have iPerson transient. And since all of them implement the iPerson service, they all have the first name field. And then I have a person service, a class that implements all three of them and has the first name field. So it satisfies all of the implementation requirements. And then I have two different services that we'll come back and talk about in a second. So let's go to the startup class. And in the startup class, we have services.addTransient, iPerson transient service with person service implementing it. So we've defined a transient service. We have scoped, add scoped, which uses iPerson scope service, person service. And then we have a singleton, which is iPerson singleton service, and a person service. So that's how we've defined it. We're using the same implementation, but defining it three different ways in dependency injection. Scoped, transient, and singleton. Okay, so now in order to show you how things behave, what I'd like to do is let's go to the index razor page for a second. And in the index razor page, I've injected this thing called service1service and given the name of underscore service1service. I have a button on the page called check names, which when clicked calls check names, and all check names does is call underscore service1service.checkName. And let's take a look at what service1service does. So here's service1service. I did not use an interface here because I just wanted to define everything within a class. So the first thing is, how do you use the services within that are injected with another service? Well, this is the way you do it. The first thing you do is you define private read-only iPerson singleton service, so the interface name and then what you want to call it internally. And notice it's private read-only iPerson scoped, private read-only, there we go, with the transient. And then I also use this service2service. We'll come back to that in a second. And then in the constructor, what we do is we pass in, and this is all happening for us, the dependency injection service provider actually passes in the different instances of the services that we're injecting. So we have iPerson singleton service, iPerson scope service, and iPerson transient service. And then here in the body of the constructor, we have underscore person singleton service, that's this one, is equal to person singleton, the one that's passed in. So we're just using a private variable here to access the dependency injection service that was provided to us. Okay, so we have those three defined here. And then we also have another service, service2 service, and that's also being used, and I've injected that as well. Now in service2 service, let's just take a quick look at that. It injects the three again as we discussed in the PowerPoint that we were just showing. And I define them here in the constructor as we just talked about. And then all I'm doing is saying what is it that what are the values in the underscore person singleton service, the scope service, and the transient service. So we just want to look at the values of first name. Okay, going back to startup one, our service one. In the check name, which is called when you click the button, first thing I want to do is let's see what the values are, the first name values are, when we first come into this, when we first inject it, okay? So we're going to do that. I'm going to do a breakpoint here so we can take a look at the debug window to see what the values are. Then I'm going to call service2 service, check name, which we just went through. Over here, I'm going to have another breakpoint just to see what the values are in service 2. Going back to service 1. Now we'll change the values of first name field in each of those different services injected. And then we'll take a look here and we'll breakpoint. So we just want to take a look, make sure that these got set, and you'll see that they did. And then we'll call service 2 again, and let's see what happens in service 2. Since they're already injected here again, let's see what happens. Okay? So that's what I want to show you. Now there's one other thing. Since I did define a singleton, I actually wanted to define the value as soon as the application started up. So I defined that in the main. And if I go to program and I go to main, this is the way. Now within the program class, you don't have access to dependencies the way that you do in other objects once the host gets started. So you do need to access a slightly different way. And here you create the host, and then you have to define the service scope. So actually the service provider is gotten this way. So you do host.services create scope, service scope, and then in service scope you get to the service provider, and then there you can get, so if you notice here, get required service, and I pass in iPerson singleton service. So this is the way to get access to the services when you don't have access to constructor injection, as we were just showing you. And then I set the value to Fred, Betty, and Wilma, and then I print it out. And you'll see here that those values will show up. But what I really want to see is what are the values of the different objects, first name property, when I start using them. And what you'll see is the first name, Fred, will actually flow through, but the other two will not. And we're going to, so when we first start up, we're going to take a breakpoint here. We're going to take a look at the debug window, look at what the values are, and then we'll go into the index page, click on the check name, and then we'll breakpoint as we showed just to show the different values. Okay? Okay, so we have the debug window showing, and let's run this. We hit the breakpoint, and we'll see the main singleton is Fred, Betty, and Wilma here. Okay, so that is the values we set up here, Fred, Betty, and Wilma. So let's continue along. We get the hello world and we get check names. Let's click on check names. And now we are in service 1 service. We're at this breakpoint. We're just printing the names when we first get into it. And let's scroll down. And notice we have the singleton version, Fred, flowed through, but nothing for scoped and nothing for transient. So let's continue along. In service 2, all we do is we just called service 2 check name, and we want to see here what flows through. And again, Fred flowed through, but nothing for scoped, nothing for transient. That's what we kind of expected. Click on continue. Now what we've done is we've set the first name in the singleton to Barney. We've set the scoped first name to Sally and the transient to Jane. And then we've written out the different values here. And if you notice, just like we thought, Barney, Sally, Jane. So now let's take a look. If you notice, we're calling service to service here. That's where we broke. So when I go ahead and click continue, now I see what the values are in service 2. The Barney flowed through. Sally flowed through because it's scoped. And as we showed in the PowerPoint, you see person scope. So we call person 1 person scoped actually flows through both. Person transient does not, however, and let's make sure that that's the case. So look in here, we see Barney, we see Sally, but we don't see anything here. Now let's continue on through. And there you have it. So what we've shown is when we started main, we got all the values. Person singleton Fred flowed through in here. The values in scope did not, and the value in transient did not. And then in service 2, singleton did. Scoped did once we set it in service 1, and transient did not here. So we saw the transient being every time you request it has a separate instance. Scoped is across the request, which was here, and singleton is across the application. Thanks for watching. And if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact me. And as always, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.